Try not to embarrass me tonight, my husband whispered as the valet opened the car door in front of the Langston Grand Hotel. He said it with a smile on his face, the kind people use when they want to sound polite in public, but his fingers tightened around my elbow just enough for me to understand he meant every word. I looked up at the towering glass building glowing against the Manhattan skyline and felt my stomach tighten beneath my silver evening gown. 38 years of marriage, and somehow Richard still knew exactly how to make me feel small with only a few words. "I'll be fine," I said softly. "Of course you will," he replied, straightening the cuff of his tuxedo. "Just stay near the back tonight. Most of these people are investors and board members. I don't want things getting awkward." Awkward. I almost smiled at the word. Once upon a time, I used to stand beside Richard at events like this while he nervously practiced business pitches in the mirror of our tiny apartment bathroom. Back then, he couldn't walk into a room without reaching for my hand first. Tonight, he was already 3 steps ahead of me before we even entered the ballroom. The charity gala occupied the entire top floor of the hotel. Crystal chandeliers spilled warm golden light across marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected the guests like water. A string quartet played near the grand staircase while servers carried trays of champagne through clusters of executives dressed in black tuxedos and designer gowns. Everything shimmered with money. The jewelry. The laughter. The effortless confidence. I paused near the entrance, smoothing my gloves while Richard immediately disappeared into a crowd of men near the bar. I watched him laugh too loudly at something one of them said. He never looked back to see if I followed. A young hostess approached me with a polite smile. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked. "Yes." She glanced down at her seating chart. "You'll be seated at table 27 this evening." Her smile flickered slightly, almost apologetic. Near the service hallway. I followed her gaze across the ballroom. Table 27 sat partially hidden behind a tall arrangement of white orchids near the kitchen doors. Not near Richard's table at the center of the room. Not near the executives or their wives. Hidden. My chest tightened, but I kept smiling. "Thank you," I said quietly. The hostess hesitated. "If there's a problem, I can ask." "No," I interrupted gently. "It's perfectly fine." She nodded and walked away. I stood there for a moment, listening to the soft clinking of glasses and distant laughter while people brushed past me without a second glance. A woman in an emerald dress bumped my shoulder lightly and didn't apologize. Somewhere across the ballroom, Richard was introducing himself to a group of investors without mentioning he even had a wife. Again. I should have been used to it by now. Over the last 10 years, Richard had slowly edited me out of his public life the way people crop unwanted details out of photographs. First, he stopped bringing me to company dinners. Then he stopped displaying family pictures in his office. Then came the comments disguised as concern. "Maybe wear something simpler. Maybe let me do the talking tonight. Maybe stay home this time." I told myself he was stressed. That success changed people. That marriages went through seasons. But standing beside that hidden table while waiters rushed around carrying silver trays, I finally understood something painful. Richard wasn't protecting me from embarrassment. He was embarrassed of me. I sat down carefully, folding my hands in my lap so no one would see them trembling. From my seat, I could barely see the stage where the charity auction would happen later that evening. The kitchen doors swung open every few seconds behind me, releasing bursts of noise and the smell of butter and garlic into the ballroom. Hidden wives belonged near service entrances, apparently. I glanced toward Richard again. He was speaking with a tall blonde woman now, one hand casually resting against the back of her chair while she laughed at something he said. He looked alive over there. Younger somehow. Important. My throat tightened, but I reached for the glass of water beside my plate instead of allowing myself to cry. I had promised myself years ago that I would never become the kind of woman who begged to be seen. The orchestra shifted into a slower melody as more guests entered the ballroom. Then suddenly, something changed. It happened so quietly at first that I almost missed it. Conversations softened near the entrance. Heads turned toward the grand staircase. Even the servers seemed to slow down. Victor Langston had arrived. Everyone in Manhattan knew his name. Billionaire CEO. Philanthropist. One of the most influential men in corporate America. Richard had spent weeks talking about tonight because Victor rarely attended public events anymore. If I can get 5 minutes with Langston, he'd told me earlier that week, this could change everything for the company. I watched Victor descend the staircase slowly, surrounded by assistants and executives trying desperately to gain his attention. At 72, he still carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room. But halfway across the ballroom, Victor suddenly stopped walking. His eyes moved across the crowd once. Then again. And then they landed directly on me. Everything inside me went still. Victor's expression changed so suddenly it made my breath catch. Shock. Recognition. Something deeper I couldn't quite name. Without saying another word to the people surrounding him, he turned and began walking straight toward table 27. Toward me. Across the ballroom, I saw Richard finally notice what was happening. The color drained from his face. The entire ballroom seemed to tilt sideways as Victor Langston continued walking toward me. Conversations faded into nervous murmurs around the room. I could feel people watching him, trying to understand why a man worth billions had suddenly abandoned a circle of senators, investors, and executives just to approach a gray-haired woman sitting beside the kitchen doors. My fingers tightened around the stem of my water glass. Victor stopped directly in front of my table. For a second, neither of us spoke. His face softened in a way that surprised me. Not polite. Not performative. Genuine. Like someone staring at a memory they thought they had. Lost forever. Eleanor, he finally said quietly. Hearing my name in his voice sent something strange through my chest. It had been more than 20 years since I last saw him in person, but I recognized the cadence immediately. Calm. Precise. Warm in a way powerful men rarely allowed themselves to sound. Around us, the room had gone almost silent. Victor smiled faintly. I knew it was you the second I walked in. I stood carefully, trying to steady myself. Victor, I said softly. It has been a very long time. He looked at me for another moment before shaking his head slowly. Too long. Across the ballroom, I caught sight of Richard weaving aggressively through the crowd toward us. He looked pale beneath the crystal lights. Nervous. I had not seen Richard nervous in years. Victor noticed him too. Richard Whitmore, he said calmly as my husband finally reached the table. Good to see you again. Richard forced a strained smile and extended his hand immediately. Mr. Langston, this is an incredible honor. I have been hoping all evening for the opportunity to speak with you about Whitmore Consulting and some expansion plans we have been developing. Victor shook his hand politely, but his attention drifted back to me almost instantly. You never told me your wife was Eleanor Bennett. Bennett. My maiden name. Hearing it spoken aloud inside that ballroom felt strangely intimate. Richard blinked once. Well, Eleanor has stayed out of the business world for many years now. Victor's expression barely changed, but something colder settled behind his eyes. That does not erase who she is. Richard gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they are losing control of a conversation but still trying to appear relaxed. Of course not. Victor ignored him completely after that. May I sit down? He asked me. I nodded slowly, still trying to process what was happening. The most powerful man in the room pulled out the chair beside mine and sat down as if we were old friends meeting for coffee instead of strangers reconnecting at a Manhattan gala. Around us, people openly stared now. I heard whispers spreading from table to table. Richard remained standing awkwardly. Beside us, trapped between wanting to stay and realizing he was no longer the center of attention. Victor folded his hands neatly on the tablecloth. You disappeared, he said quietly. After Chicago. The memory hit me immediately. Snow falling outside towering office windows. Long nights reviewing market projections. Cheap coffee and impossible deadlines. I had been 39 back then. Sharp. Driven. Certain my future would be larger than the small apartment Richard and I shared at the time. Victor had been younger too. Ambitious in a quieter way than the newspapers ever described him. Life changed, I answered gently. Victor studied my face carefully. I looked for you for years. Richard shifted beside us. Eleanor never mentioned knowing you personally. Victor glanced at him briefly. That is surprising. There was nothing openly hostile in his tone, but Richard's jaw tightened anyway. A server approached our table carrying champagne. Victor accepted 2 glasses and handed one directly to me before refusing the third. Richard lowered his hand slowly after realizing the extra glass had not been meant for him. To Eleanor Bennett, Victor said softly, raising his glass. The smartest strategist I ever worked with. The silence around us deepened. Someone near the stage dropped a fork. Richard stared at me like he was suddenly seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. I lowered my eyes toward the bubbles rising inside the champagne flute because I did not know what else to do. It had been decades since anyone described me that way. Smart. Brilliant. Important. Those words had slowly disappeared from my life after marriage. Replaced by others. Supportive wife. Gracious hostess. Richard's better half. I had almost forgotten there was a time when people listened when I spoke. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair. Do you remember the Denver presentation? He asked me with a faint smile. Despite myself, I laughed softly. You mean the one where the projector exploded 20 minutes before the investors arrived? You rebuilt the entire presentation by hand using hotel stationery and a marker. We still lost the account. No, Victor corrected gently. We lost 1 investor. We gained 3 others because of you. Richard remained completely silent beside us now. I could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. Victor turned toward him calmly. Your wife changed the trajectory of my company before Langston Global ever existed. Richard swallowed once. I did not realize they worked that closely together. Victor held his gaze for 1 long second. That is becoming very clear. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. The trembling had stopped without me even noticing. For the first time that evening, I no longer felt hidden beside the kitchen doors. The atmosphere around our table changed completely after Victor spoke my maiden name out loud. People who had ignored me all evening suddenly began glancing over with curiosity sharp enough to feel against my skin. A woman seated nearby leaned toward her husband and whispered something while staring directly at me. Across the ballroom, I noticed 2 younger executives quietly pulling out their phones, probably searching my name online. Richard remained standing beside the table, but his confidence had started slipping in small, visible ways. He adjusted his cufflinks twice within a minute. Smoothed his tie even though it was already perfectly straight. Smiled too quickly whenever someone looked our direction. I had seen him do that before during difficult negotiations. It was the smile he used when panic began creeping in underneath the surface. Victor did not seem to notice any of it. Or perhaps he noticed everything and simply chose not to care. You still tilt your head when you are thinking, he said to me softly. I blinked in surprise. What? A faint smile touched his face. You used to do that in meetings whenever someone presented a weak strategy. You would tilt your head slightly before dismantling the entire proposal in 5 minutes. I laughed quietly before I could stop myself. The sound startled me almost as much as it startled Richard. I could not remember the last time I laughed naturally at one of Richard's corporate events. That sounds dramatic, I said. It was accurate, Victor replied calmly. One of the event coordinators suddenly rushed toward our table looking breathless. Mr. Langston, she said nervously, the board members are waiting for you in the reception lounge. Victor did not even turn his head. They can wait. The young woman looked stunned. Of course, sir. She hurried away immediately. Richard cleared his throat. Victor, perhaps Eleanor should let you return to your guests. I know how busy evenings like this can become. Victor finally looked at him directly. I am exactly where I want to be. The words landed softly, but Richard's expression tightened instantly. I lowered my eyes toward the tablecloth, pretending to adjust my bracelet while my thoughts drifted somewhere far away. 26 years earlier, before Richard's company existed, before the penthouse apartment and luxury vacations and private clubs, There had been a tiny office in downtown Chicago with stained carpet and flickering fluorescent lights. Victor had rented half the floor of a failing building because it was all he could afford at the time. I had worked there as an independent consultant after leaving a larger firm that underestimated me the moment I turned 40. Those months had been exhausting. Long nights, cold coffee, endless investor presentations. But I remembered something else too. I remembered being respected. Victor studied me carefully. "Do you still write?" I looked up slowly. "Right. Your market analyses. Your strategic reports. You used to fill legal pads faster than anyone I had ever seen." My fingers rested against the edge of the champagne glass. "No," I admitted quietly. "Not for a very long time." Victor seemed genuinely disappointed by the answer. "That is a loss for the world." Richard forced out another laugh. "Eleanor has enjoyed focusing on family life instead." Family life. Such a clean phrase for something that had slowly erased me piece by piece over decades. I remembered all the mornings spent proofreading Richard's presentations while he slept upstairs. All the dinners interrupted by business calls. All the conferences where I stayed home because he claimed spouses complicated negotiations. Every sacrifice had sounded temporary at first. Until one day I realized my entire identity had quietly disappeared behind his success. A middle-aged couple approached our table hesitantly. "Victor," the man said carefully, "we did not realize you knew Mrs. Whitmore." Victor answered without hesitation. Mrs. Whitmore was one of the sharpest minds in strategic consulting long before most people in this room understood what strategy even meant. The couple immediately shifted their attention toward me with visible respect. "That is incredible," the woman said warmly. "Were you in finance?" Before I could answer, Richard stepped in too quickly. Eleanor always preferred staying behind the scenes. Victor's eyes moved toward him again. Calm. Observant. Dangerous in the quietest possible way. "Some people are pushed behind the scenes," he said softly. Richard's face lost color for half a second. The couple exchanged an awkward glance before excusing themselves politely. I stared down at my folded hands while heat rose slowly into my chest. Victor had not raised his voice once all evening, yet somehow every sentence felt like he was uncovering pieces of my life I had spent years trying not to examine too closely. Across the ballroom, the orchestra transitioned into a slower arrangement while waiters lit candles on the tables for dinner service. The soft golden light reflected against crystal glasses and polished silverware. Earlier that evening, this room had made me feel invisible. Now it felt as though every eye followed me whenever I moved. Richard leaned closer toward me, his smile frozen painfully tight. "Can I speak with you privately for a moment?" he asked under his breath. Before I could answer, Victor stood slowly from his chair. "Actually," he said calmly, "I was hoping to introduce Eleanor to several people before dinner begins." Richard blinked. "Introduce her?" Victor adjusted the sleeve of his tailored jacket. "There are individuals here tonight who would consider it an honor to meet the woman who helped shape some of the earliest growth models in my career." My breath caught slightly. Richard stared at him in complete silence. Victor turned toward me then and offered his hand with old-fashioned politeness. "Would you walk with me, Eleanor?" For the first time in years, Richard looked at me not with embarrassment or dismissal, but with fear. The ballroom seemed to part around Victor and me as we began walking away from table 27. I could feel hundreds of eyes following us across the marble floor, but for some reason I no longer wanted to disappear from them. Victor walked beside me at an unhurried pace, his hand resting lightly near my elbow without touching me, like a gentleman from another era who understood dignity without needing to display it loudly. Behind us, I could practically feel Richard standing frozen beside the table we had been given near the kitchen doors. Earlier that evening, he had wanted me hidden. Now the most important man in the room was leading me directly into the center of attention. The orchestra continued playing softly overhead while conversations resumed around us in nervous waves. We stopped beside a group of executives near the enormous windows overlooking Central Park. The city lights glittered below like scattered diamonds against black velvet. Victor turned calmly toward the group. "I would like you all to meet Eleanor Bennett." The name landed differently this time. Stronger somehow. One of the executives blinked in surprise. Bennett, he repeated. The Eleanor Bennett from the Chicago market restructuring papers? I stared at him, startled. You know those reports? The man gave a short laugh. Know them? They were required reading during my first year at Kellerman Financial. Another woman beside him nodded immediately. Your analysis on regional retail collapse was ahead of its time by at least a decade. For a moment, I genuinely thought they might be confusing me with someone else. My old reports had been written so long ago that the paper copies probably sat forgotten in dusty storage boxes somewhere. I remembered staying awake until 2 a.m. writing those market breakdowns by hand while Richard slept on the couch beside stacks of unpaid bills. Back then, we could barely afford groceries some weeks. I had believed those reports would open doors for me eventually. Instead, life moved differently. Marriage. Children. Sacrifices that arrived quietly one after another until ambition no longer fit inside my daily routine. Victor watched my face carefully. I told you, he said softly. People remember excellence. The words settled deep inside me in a place I had not visited for years. Excellence. Not usefulness. Not supportiveness. Not loyalty. Excellence. More guests slowly gathered around us as conversations spread through the ballroom. Someone mentioned my work at Hanover Consulting. Another person remembered a lecture I gave in Boston nearly 25 years earlier. Tiny fragments of a woman I had almost forgotten began returning to me piece by piece through the memories of strangers. I noticed Richard approaching again through the crowd, this time moving much faster than before. His expression remained composed for anyone casually watching, but I knew him too well not to recognize desperation underneath it. Eleanor, he interrupted with a strained smile, everyone is waiting for dinner to begin. Maybe we should sit down. Victor glanced briefly toward him. Actually, several board members were just asking if Eleanor would join us at the head table. Richard's entire body stiffened. The head table. One of the executives nearby spoke immediately. Of course she should. Frankly, this is the most interesting conversation anyone has had all evening. Soft laughter rippled through the group. Richard attempted to smile along with them, but his eyes had started losing their calm polish. I was not aware Eleanor remained involved in the business community, he said carefully. I looked at him then. Really looked at him. For years, Richard had spoken for me in rooms like this. He answered questions before I could. Redirected conversations. Introduced me simply as his wife while listing his own achievements for 20 minutes straight. I used to believe marriage meant allowing one person to shine brighter when necessary. I did not realize I had slowly allowed myself to disappear completely. I was involved long before you met me, I said quietly. Richard blinked at me in surprise. The group around us fell silent for half a second. It was not what I said that startled him. It was the fact that I said it publicly. Victor's eyes softened slightly beside me, almost approvingly. A waiter approached carrying fresh champagne, and this time 3 glasses were offered. Victor accepted one. I accepted another. Richard reached for the third too quickly and nearly knocked the tray sideways in the process. The waiter steadied it politely while Richard muttered an apology under his breath. Tiny cracks. Small things most people would never notice. But I noticed because I had spent 38 years cleaning up behind Richard's polished image. Victor raised his glass slightly toward me. Do you know what I remember most about Eleanor? He asked the group. Nobody answered. Victor smiled faintly. She was the only person in every meeting who was not afraid to disagree with powerful men. A few people laughed softly. That sounds dangerous, one woman joked. It was necessary, Victor replied calmly. Then he looked directly at me. And rare. Something warm and painful tightened in my chest all at once. Not because Victor admired me, but because somewhere along the way, I had stopped admiring myself. The ballroom lights shimmered against the enormous crystal chandeliers overhead while servers prepared the dining tables for the next course. Beyond the windows, New York stretched endlessly into the dark. Beautiful. Restless. Alive. Richard stood only a few feet away from me, but for the first time in years, he looked like the outsider in my world instead of the other way around. Dinner service began 20 minutes later, but by then the energy inside the ballroom had shifted so completely that even the waitstaff seemed aware something unusual was unfolding. The original seating arrangement quietly disappeared without anyone formally announcing it. Place cards were moved. Chairs rearranged. Conversations redirected. By the time the first course arrived, I was seated beside Victor at the head table beneath the massive crystal chandeliers while Richard sat 3 seats farther down near a venture capitalist from Boston who barely acknowledged him. Earlier that evening, Richard had wanted me hidden beside the service hallway. Now people kept leaning across the table asking for my opinion on markets, leadership, and industry trends I had not publicly discussed in over 20 years. It all felt strangely unreal. A woman seated across from me adjusted her diamond bracelet and smiled warmly. "Victor says you predicted the Midwest retail collapse before anyone else did." I lowered my napkin carefully onto my lap. "I made observations. That is all." Victor glanced sideways at me. "You published models that half the financial sector ignored until they became impossible to deny." Several people around the table exchanged impressed looks. Richard remained unusually quiet. He kept checking his phone every few minutes, though I noticed the screen was dark each time he lifted it. A habit. Something to do with his hands while he struggled to regain control of the room. One of the younger executives leaned forward eagerly. "Mrs. Whitmore, were you involved in Whitmore Consulting during its early growth phase?" Before I could answer, Richard spoke immediately. "Eleanor supported me emotionally while I built the company." Supported me emotionally. Such an elegant way to erase decades of invisible labor. I stared down briefly at the candlelight reflecting against my water glass. There had been a time when I handled nearly every proposal Richard presented to investors. I rewrote contracts at midnight while rocking a feverish child to sleep with my foot. I corrected financial projections while cooking dinner. I memorized client histories so Richard could appear effortlessly prepared during meetings. Slowly, almost without noticing, my intelligence had become something he borrowed privately while presenting himself publicly as the sole architect of our success. Victor set down his fork with deliberate calm. "That is not exactly how I remember it." The table fell silent. Richard forced out a careful smile. "I am sure Eleanor contributed ideas here and there." Victor looked directly at him. "Richard, the expansion framework your company used during its first national acquisition was based almost entirely on Eleanor's Chicago restructuring model." My heartbeat slowed strangely instead of quickening. Perhaps because some part of me had grown too tired over the years to keep pretending anymore. The executive beside Victor frowned slightly. "Wait. Are you saying Whitmore Consulting was built using Eleanor's work?" Richard laughed too quickly. "Built is an exaggeration." Victor did not smile. "No. It is accurate." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken aloud all evening. Somewhere across the ballroom, silverware clinked softly against china while the orchestra continued playing near the stage. But at our table, nobody moved for several seconds. I watched Richard loosen his tie slightly beneath the warm chandelier lights. Tiny beads of sweat had formed near his temples despite the cool temperature inside the ballroom. For the first time in decades, he looked uncertain. Vulnerable even. Victor turned toward me calmly. "Do you remember the Langford acquisition meeting?" I nodded slowly. The investors nearly walked out. Because Richard's projections were incomplete, Victor said evenly. "You stayed awake for 36 hours rebuilding the entire strategy from scratch." A few people at the table looked stunned. Richard shifted in his chair. "That was a long time ago." Victor's voice remained perfectly level. "Success usually begins a long time ago." I lowered my eyes toward the candle burning between us. The memory returned so vividly it almost hurt. A tiny apartment kitchen. Coffee growing cold beside stacks of paperwork. Richard asleep upstairs while I sat at the dining table calculating market risk projections until sunrise because failure would have destroyed us financially. Back then, I believed sacrifice was temporary. I believed love naturally involved carrying each other through difficult seasons. I did not realize some people slowly become comfortable standing on another person's shoulders while accepting applause alone. One of the women seated near the end of the table looked toward me carefully. "Why did you stop working?" The question landed gently, but it opened something inside me I had kept sealed shut for years. I folded my hands together beneath the tablecloth before answering. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. We had children. Richard traveled constantly. Someone needed to hold everything together at home. I smiled faintly without humor. Then one temporary sacrifice became another. Nobody interrupted me. Victor watched quietly while the candlelight reflected softly in his eyes. "Did you miss it?" the woman asked. I thought about all the mornings I spent alone after the children left for college. The notebooks hidden in my desk drawer filled with unfinished ideas. The articles I never submitted. The conferences Richard attended without me because he claimed spouses distracted from negotiations. Every day, I answered honestly. Richard finally spoke again, but his voice sounded thinner now. Eleanor always had a tendency to romanticize the past. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair. "No," he said calmly. "I think she simply remembers it accurately." Richard stared at him across the table, and for the first time since I married him nearly 4 decades earlier, I realized something unsettling. My husband had spent years making me feel small because he could not tolerate standing beside the full version of who I used to be. The rest of the ballroom slowly resumed its rhythm after dinner was served, but the atmosphere at the head table never fully recovered from Victor's quiet revelation. Conversations continued in softer voices now, threaded with curiosity and caution. I could feel people reassessing me every time I reached for my glass or answered a question. Earlier that evening, they had looked through me the way wealthy people often look through hotel staff or distant relatives they do not consider important. Now they watched me carefully, as though they were trying to solve a puzzle they should have noticed years ago. Richard barely touched his food. His usual polished confidence had begun cracking beneath the pressure of losing control over the narrative he had carefully built around himself for decades. Every few minutes, another executive approached our end of the table to greet Victor, but eventually their attention shifted toward me instead. Some remembered articles I had written. Others recalled conferences where my research had circulated quietly through consulting circles years before Richard's company became successful. It felt surreal listening to strangers describe parts of my former life more clearly than my own husband ever had. Victor remained calm through all of it. He never exaggerated my accomplishments. Never performed admiration theatrically. That was what unsettled Richard the most. Victor spoke about me the way people discuss facts they assume everyone already knows. At one point, a younger woman seated near the center of the table leaned toward me with visible excitement. "Mrs. Whitmore, is it true you predicted the regional banking instability back in the 90s? I smiled faintly. I suggested several smaller institutions were expanding too aggressively. Victor gave a quiet nod. 3 years before federal analysts admitted the same thing. The woman looked stunned. "Why have we never heard about you?" The question settled over the table heavily. Richard immediately reached for his wine glass. Eleanor preferred privacy, he answered smoothly. I looked at him across the candlelight. For so many years, I had allowed him to tell my story because correcting him felt exhausting. Easier to stay quiet. Easier to shrink than constantly fight to exist beside someone who only seemed comfortable when he stood alone in the spotlight. But tonight, something inside me had started waking up. Slowly. Carefully. Like a person opening curtains after living in darkness too long. "That is not entirely true," I said softly. Richard's hand froze around his wine glass. Several people looked toward me at once. My voice remained calm. I stopped speaking publicly because eventually it became easier for everyone if I stayed in the background. Silence spread across the table again. Not uncomfortable this time. Intentional. Listening silence. Richard forced out a thin smile. "I think we are making things sound far more dramatic than they really were." Victor turned toward him with quiet precision. "Richard, diminishing someone repeatedly over time often looks very calm from the outside." Nobody spoke after that. The orchestra continued playing softly near the stage while servers removed dinner plates beneath the glow of chandeliers overhead. Somewhere across the ballroom, laughter erupted from another table, completely unaware of the tension unfolding at ours. I looked down at my folded napkin while old memories surfaced one after another. Richard asking me not to attend a conference because the wives of investors were younger. Richard introducing me once as old-fashioned while everyone laughed politely. Richard telling me my ideas sounded dated even while using those same ideas privately in meetings. Small moments. Tiny cuts spread across years until eventually you stop recognizing yourself. Victor's voice interrupted my thoughts gently. Do you still keep notes? I looked up. Notes. Ideas. Observations. Market trends. You used to carry legal pads everywhere. I hesitated before answering. Sometimes. Richard laughed quietly, though there was no humor in it. Eleanor still fills notebooks at home. Half the guest room closet is full of them. The comment was meant to sound affectionate, but I heard the dismissal underneath it immediately. Harmless little hobbies for an aging wife. Victor did too. I would be interested in reading them, he said calmly. Richard blinked. Reading them? Yes. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair. Intelligent people do not suddenly become irrelevant because they grow older. Something tightened sharply in my throat. Not sadness exactly. Recognition. There was a particular kind of loneliness that came with becoming invisible inside your own marriage. You begin doubting your instincts, your intelligence, your worth. Eventually, you stop offering opinions because nobody seems interested in hearing them anyway. Yet tonight, every time Victor spoke to me, it felt as though he was addressing the version of myself I buried years ago to make Richard comfortable. A member of the event staff approached the stage microphone moments later and announced the beginning of the foundation presentations. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly while attention shifted toward the front of the room. Victor stood smoothly from his chair. Before we begin the auction, he said quietly to me, there is someone I would like you to meet afterward. I looked up curiously. Who? A faint smile crossed his face. The chairwoman of the Langston Global Foundation. She has spent years searching for someone capable of leading our new economic advisory initiative. Richard straightened immediately beside us. Victor, surely there are already dozens of qualified candidates for something at that level. Victor buttoned his jacket calmly. There are candidates, he replied. Then his eyes settled on me again. But very few visionaries. For the second time that evening, the room fell silent around us. And this time, Richard looked less like a husband sitting beside his wife and more like a man realizing he had spent years underestimating the most important person in the room. The ballroom lights dimmed further as the foundation presentation officially began, washing the enormous room in soft amber light that reflected against crystal glasses and polished marble floors. A large screen descended behind the stage while guests settled into quieter conversations at their tables. Normally, this would have been Richard's favorite part of the evening. Public recognition. Strategic networking. Visibility among powerful people. But tonight, I could feel him unraveling beside me in tiny, controlled movements he hoped nobody else noticed. He kept adjusting his posture every few seconds. Reaching for his water glass without drinking from it. Smiling too late after someone made a joke nearby. For years, Richard had mastered the appearance of confidence so completely that most people never questioned it. But confidence built on controlling someone else's silence becomes fragile once that silence disappears. Victor stood near the stage speaking quietly with several members of the foundation board while guests watched him with automatic admiration. Even from across the room, his presence seemed to steady everything around him. He glanced toward me once during the conversation, and one of the board members immediately followed his gaze before smiling politely in my direction. Richard noticed that too. This has gone far enough, he murmured suddenly under his breath. I turned toward him slowly. What do you mean? His smile remained fixed for appearances, but tension sharpened every word. Victor is making assumptions about things he does not fully understand. I studied him quietly. Such as? Richard lowered his voice further. About our marriage. About the company. About you. About you. The words lingered strangely between us. Not with affection. With irritation. As though my existence had become inconvenient now that other people finally recognized it. I do not think he is assuming anything, I answered softly. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. Eleanor, please do not do this here. The old instinct rose inside me immediately. Stay quiet. Avoid conflict. Protect his image. I had spent nearly 4 decades smoothing over uncomfortable moments before they became visible to other people. But tonight something felt different. Maybe because for the first time in years, I no longer felt crazy for remembering who I used to be. Do what? I asked calmly. Richard looked away briefly before answering. Humiliate me. The word stunned me so deeply that I almost laughed. Humiliate him. After years of shrinking myself to protect his ego, he genuinely believed my simple honesty was cruelty. Before I could respond, applause erupted across the ballroom as Victor stepped onto the stage beside the foundation chairwoman, Margaret Holloway. Elegant and silver-haired, Margaret carried herself with the same effortless authority as women who have spent decades being listened to carefully. She welcomed the guests warmly before beginning the annual presentation about the Foundation's economic development programs. I listened politely at first, but halfway through her speech, Margaret suddenly smiled toward Victor. This year, she announced, we have also begun searching for a lead advisor for our new national initiative focused on rebuilding financial opportunity in underserved communities. Several guests nodded with visible interest. Margaret continued. Finding someone with both strategic brilliance and real-world perspective has proven more difficult than expected. Victor stepped toward the microphone then. Calm. Certain. Actually, he said, I believe we may have found the right person this evening. A quiet murmur spread through the ballroom. Instantly, Richard straightened beside me so abruptly his chair scraped softly against the floor. Victor's eyes moved across the crowd before settling directly on me. Some of the greatest minds disappear not because they lose their talent, he said evenly, but because life convinces them their voice no longer matters. The room fell completely silent. I felt every heartbeat inside my chest. Victor continued speaking without raising his voice. Tonight I had the privilege of reconnecting with someone whose work shaped critical financial strategy long before many current leaders entered the industry. A woman whose intelligence influenced more success stories than most people here realize. I heard whispers spreading again through the tables around us. Richard's face had gone completely pale beneath the chandelier light. Victor extended his hand gently toward me from the stage. Eleanor Bennett Whitmore. My breath caught sharply. For one suspended second, the entire ballroom turned toward me at once. Hundreds of eyes. Executives. Investors. Politicians. Socialites. Earlier that evening, I had been hidden beside the service entrance like an afterthought. Now the most powerful man in the room was publicly asking me to stand beside him. Richard leaned closer quickly. Eleanor, he whispered tightly, do not turn this into some spectacle. I looked at him slowly. Something inside me finally became clear in that moment. Richard was not afraid of embarrassment. He was afraid people might finally see how much of his success had rested quietly on the shoulders of the woman he spent years minimizing. Around us, applause began building across the ballroom. Soft at first. Then louder. Victor still stood waiting near the stage with calm patience, not forcing me, simply offering space for me to exist fully again. My hands trembled lightly as I rose from my chair. But this time, it was not from shame. It was from realizing how long it had been since anyone invited me back into the light. The applause followed me all the way to the stage. Not loud or theatrical at first, but steady. Respectful. The kind of applause people give when they realize they may have overlooked someone. Important. I walked carefully between the tables while candlelight flickered across crystal glasses and polished silverware. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor, each step feeling strangely unreal. Earlier that evening, I had entered this ballroom trying not to take up too much space. Now hundreds of people were watching me cross the room as though I belonged at the center of it. Victor waited near the stage with calm patience, his hand extended slightly toward me without pressure. When I finally reached him, he greeted me with the same quiet respect he had shown all evening. No performance. No pity. Just recognition. Margaret Holloway smiled warmly beside him. "Eleanor," she said, "it is an honor to finally meet you." Finally. The word settled deeply inside me, as though somewhere, in rooms I had never entered, my name had still existed long after I stopped believing it mattered. Victor turned toward the audience again. "Many people spend their careers chasing visibility," he said calmly. "But some of the most valuable minds spend years working quietly behind the success of others." I felt Richard's eyes on me from across the ballroom even without looking at him. Victor continued. "What impressed me about Eleanor was never just intelligence. It was clarity. The ability to see what everyone else missed." Margaret nodded beside him. Victor has referenced Eleanor's early strategic models for years during foundation planning discussions. A ripple of surprise moved through the room again. I could hear whispers spreading between tables. My name passing from person to person like something being rediscovered. Victor looked toward me gently. "Would you say a few words?" For one terrifying second, panic rose inside me. I had not spoken publicly in years. Not really. Somewhere along the way, I became so accustomed to minimizing myself that even standing under bright lights felt unfamiliar now. But then I looked out across the ballroom. At the executives. The investors. The polished smiles and expensive jewelry and carefully constructed power. And suddenly I realized something painful. Most people in this room had no idea how many women quietly disappear. Inside successful marriages. How many intelligent women slowly become assistants to their own lives while somebody else receives credit for their sacrifices. I stepped closer to the microphone slowly. The ballroom became completely silent. "Thank you," I said softly. My voice trembled slightly at first, but steadied after the second sentence. "I did not expect to be standing up here tonight." A few gentle laughs moved through the audience. I glanced briefly toward Victor. Many years ago, I believed hard work naturally spoke for itself. I believed if you supported the people you loved long enough, eventually they would remember to turn around and acknowledge you too. Silence settled heavily across the room. "Sometimes they do," I continued quietly. "And sometimes they become so accustomed to your support that they stop seeing you altogether." Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, someone slowly lowered their champagne glass onto a table. Nobody moved otherwise. "I stopped using my voice professionally a long time ago," I admitted. "Not because I had nothing left to say, but because after enough years of being interrupted, dismissed, or quietly set aside, you begin convincing yourself silence is easier." My eyes drifted toward Richard then. He sat rigidly at the table, his jaw tight beneath the chandelier light. I did not speak his name. I did not need to. "What I have learned tonight," I said softly, "is that invisibility is not the same thing as irrelevance." The room remained completely still. Victor watched me with an expression I could not fully describe. Not admiration exactly. Respect. Recognition. Like he understood how difficult those words were for me to say aloud after so many years. I stepped back slightly from the microphone, believing I was finished. But Margaret touched my arm gently. "Actually," she said warmly, "there is one more thing." She turned toward the audience with a smile. After speaking with Victor this evening and reviewing Eleanor's previous work, the Langston Global Foundation would like to formally invite Eleanor Bennett Whitmore to serve as senior advisor for our National Economic Initiative. For one suspended second, I forgot how to breathe. Then the ballroom erupted into applause. Real applause this time. Loud. Immediate. People rose from their chairs around the room. Some smiling. Some stunned. Some suddenly eager to be associated with the woman they ignored 2 hours earlier. I stared at Margaret in complete disbelief. "I do not know what to say," I whispered. Victor's voice remained calm beside me. "You could say yes." Soft laughter moved through the audience again. I looked down briefly at my trembling hands. The same hands Richard once claimed looked too old for formal events. The same hands that spent decades building other people's futures while quietly abandoning their own. Then I lifted my eyes toward the ballroom again. toward the people finally seeing me clearly, and for the first time in years, I did not feel invisible standing in my own skin. The applause continued long after I accepted the foundation's offer. People stood from their tables smiling toward me, raising champagne glasses, nodding with admiration that felt almost surreal after so many years of being overlooked. I thanked Margaret softly and shook her hand, still trying to process what had just happened. Victor remained beside me without rushing the moment, allowing me space to absorb it fully. Across the ballroom, I finally looked toward Richard again. He was clapping too. Slowly. Mechanically. His smile remained fixed in place, but his eyes no longer held certainty. They held calculation. Fear. Confusion. As though he was trying to understand how the woman he spent years hiding had suddenly become the center of the room without his permission. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Executives approached me asking for meetings. Economists referenced articles I barely remembered writing. One woman from a publishing company asked whether I had ever considered writing a memoir about women disappearing inside corporate marriages. Every conversation felt strangely disorienting, like stepping back into a version of myself I thought no longer existed. Yet underneath all of it, another realization slowly settled deeper inside me with every passing hour. None of these people had changed who I was tonight. They had simply recognized what had already been there all along. Around midnight, the gala finally began winding down. Guests filtered slowly toward the elevators while servers cleared half-empty champagne glasses from the tables. The orchestra had stopped playing, leaving behind only the soft hum of expensive conversations fading into the marble halls outside. I stood near the ballroom windows staring out over Manhattan while snow began drifting lightly through the dark sky beyond the glass. Tiny white flakes swirling above endless city lights. Victor approached quietly beside me. "You handled tonight beautifully," he said. I smiled faintly. "I do not think I have ever been more terrified." He laughed softly. "Courage usually looks exactly like that." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Victor looked toward the snow outside the windows. "You know," he said calmly, "there was a period years ago when several firms tried very hard to recruit you after Chicago." I turned toward him in surprise. "What? You never knew?" I shook my head slowly. Victor's expression darkened slightly with realization. "Richard told everyone you were no longer interested in consulting work. That you wanted to focus entirely on family life." The words landed heavily inside my chest. Not because they shocked me completely. Some part of me had always suspected opportunities quietly disappeared without explanation over the years. But hearing it confirmed aloud felt different. Real. Final. I looked down at the city lights below us while old memories rearranged themselves painfully in my mind. The unanswered calls. The invitations that stopped arriving. The gradual shrinking of my world until home became the only place anyone expected me to exist. Victor's voice softened. "I should have searched harder for you." I shook my head gently. "No. I disappeared willingly for a long time too." Before he could answer, Richard approached us from behind. His face looked exhausted now beneath the ballroom lights. "Older somehow." "Victor," he said carefully, "thank you again for tonight." Victor nodded politely. "Of course." Richard looked toward me next. "Eleanor, we should probably head home." Home. The word felt strangely hollow suddenly. Not because I hated our house, but because I finally understood how lonely I had been inside it. I studied Richard quietly for several seconds. The man standing in front of me was not cruel in the obvious ways people expect. He had never screamed at me in public. Never humiliated me with dramatic cruelty. Instead, he had done something quieter over decades. He had reduced me inch by inch until even I stopped believing my own voice mattered. And somehow that realization hurt more than anger ever could. "You can go ahead," I said softly. Richard blinked. "What?" "I am staying a little longer." His jaw tightened immediately. "Eleanor, it is after midnight." "I know." The silence between us stretched painfully. Richard lowered his voice. "Can we please not do this here?" The same sentence again. As though my honesty was the problem instead of the years that created it. I glanced toward the ballroom around us one final time. The chandeliers. The polished marble. The room where I arrived feeling invisible only hours earlier. Then I looked back at my husband calmly. I spent years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger, I said quietly. Richard stared at me without speaking. I continued softly. Tonight was the first time in a very long time that I remembered who I was before I learned how to disappear. His face shifted then. Not anger exactly. Regret. But regret arrives strangely late sometimes. Too late to restore years already lost. Victor stepped back respectfully, giving us privacy without leaving completely. Richard rubbed a hand across his face tiredly. Eleanor, I never meant for any of this to happen. I believed him. That was the tragic part. Most people do not wake up intending to erase someone they love. They simply grow comfortable being centered while another person quietly fades into the background supporting them. I know, I answered gently. But it happened anyway. Snow continued falling outside the windows while silence settled between us. Finally, Richard nodded once. Small. Defeated. Then he turned and walked slowly toward the elevators alone. I watched him disappear into the marble hallway before looking back out at the city lights again. For years, I thought being unseen meant I no longer existed. But standing there beneath the chandeliers with Manhattan glowing beneath the snow outside, I finally understood something important. I had never been invisible. I had simply been surrounded by people who stopped looking.